When a woman disappears from a quiet Tucson neighborhood, the case doesn't usually make national news. But when that woman is the mother of a national television anchor, everything changes. Cameras show up, reporters camp outside the house, hashtags trend. And somewhere in that noise, a family is left waiting for a phone call, a knock on the door, anything. That's the situation Savannah Guthrie's family has lived in since February 1st, 2026, when 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie vanished from her Tucson home in the middle of the night. Nancy was 84 years old, a mother of 3, a grandmother, and by every account, a fixture of her Tucson neighborhood. The kind of woman neighbors describe as sharp, independent, and fiercely private about her own life, which is part of what's made this case so hard to crack. She wasn't a public figure. Her daughter is. And that single fact turned a local disappearance into a national obsession almost overnight, with all the benefits and all the distortions that come with that kind of attention. More than 5 months later, there's still no arrest, no confirmed proof of life, no body, and a question that keeps resurfacing every time a new detail leaks out before investigators are ready to confirm it. Are the people running this investigation making it harder to solve by holding too much back from the public? One man has been watching this case more closely than almost anyone outside the investigation because 24 years ago, he lived a version of it. His name is Ed Smart. In 2002, his 14-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, was taken at knife point from her own bedroom in Salt Lake City. She was gone for 9 months, and she came home alive, largely, Ed has said, because ordinary people were paying attention. Ed Smart has spoken publicly several times since Nancy Guthrie disappeared, drawing a direct line between what his family went through and what the Guthries are going through now. Tonight, we're using his perspective as a lens to ask a harder question about every high-profile disappearance like this one. When investigators go quiet, are they protecting the case or costing it time it doesn't have? To understand the tension Ed Smart is talking about, you have to understand what's actually been confirmed in the Guthrie case and what hasn't. Nancy Guthrie was reported missing on the morning of February 1st. Investigators quickly concluded a crime had occurred inside her home, though they've never publicly named a suspect. In the weeks that followed, a flood of ransom demands hit the family and the media, some real attempts at extortion, most of them fake. The size of the audience watching this case is part of what makes the information gap so strange. This isn't a story only true crime forums are tracking. On her own podcast, Kim Kardashian brought the case up unprompted, telling her audience she found it heartbreaking that months in, there seemed to be nothing solid for the public to hold on to. Her guest that episode, crime junkie host Ashley Flowers, someone who covers unsolved cases professionally, said she was almost as in the dark as anyone else, adding that she found the total silence around new information unusual, even by the standards of a slow-moving case. When two people who talk about true crime for a living say they can't find a thread to follow, that's a meaningful signal about how tightly this information has been controlled. One of those fake senders, a California man named Derek Kalela, pleaded guilty in July to 2 federal felony counts, sending a ransom demand across state lines and using a telecommunications device to threaten or harass. Under his plea agreement, he's expected to serve 5 years of probation, with sentencing scheduled for September 10th before a federal judge in Arizona. Separately, a judge has ordered him into inpatient substance abuse treatment ahead of that sentencing. That individual case is now essentially closed. But it left behind a bigger problem for the investigation as a whole. Once fake ransom notes are mixed in with whatever real leads exist, the public, and reportedly even different parts of the FBI, start disagreeing about which pieces of evidence can be trusted at all. That brings us to the detail that's driven the most speculation in this case. In late June, sources close to the investigation told reporters that one ransom note, allegedly sent earlier in the case, claimed Nancy Guthrie had already died, describing her as buried in nature, and stating her death was unintentional. The note reportedly offered no direct apology to the family, only an explanation. That detail alone reframed the entire case for a lot of true crime followers. If real, it meant the kidnapping for ransom investigation the public had been following for months might actually already be a homicide investigation, and had been for a while without the public knowing it. Just days later, in early July, the FBI's Phoenix field office pushed back. In a statement to Reuters, an FBI official said, investigators do not believe any of the 3 ransom notes connected to the case, including that one, are genuine. Then, only days after that, the FBI muddied the water again, confirming the case is still officially being investigated as a kidnapping for ransom, without clarifying which notes, if any, they consider legitimate. Retired FBI agent Steve Moore, who's followed the case closely, put it bluntly on News Nation, the more he watches the Bureau's shifting public statements, the more he believes there's real internal disagreement, not just about how to characterize the case publicly, but about the underlying evidence itself, right down to which pieces of it investigators consider valid. He's pointed out that perspectives can genuinely differ between field offices and headquarters, and separately between the case agents actually working the file day to day and the managers signing off on public statements. Moore also raised something the Buried in Nature letter itself doesn't answer, even if it's real. Kidnappers who intended to collect a ransom sometimes abandon that plan, he noted, specifically when the person they took has died in captivity. Meaning even a genuine confession-style note wouldn't necessarily tell you whether this started as a kidnapping gone wrong or something else entirely. Whatever the internal reality inside the Bureau, his read is that the public statements alone tell you a disagreement exists, even if they don't tell you which side is winning it. This is exactly the kind of information fog Ed Smart has been warning about. In an interview on the Brian Entin Investigates podcast, Smart said plainly that keeping the public partially informed, feeding out just enough detail to keep a story alive without giving people what they need to actually help, is a mistake. He knows it firsthand. When Elizabeth disappeared, his family felt the same friction with investigators. Information they needed to make sense of the search wasn't always coming to them either. Here's where his own case becomes the clearest example of what he means. Weeks into the search for Elizabeth, her younger sister, 9-year-old Mary Catherine, who had been in the room the night of the kidnapping, recalled that the abductor might be a man the family knew only as Emmanuel, an itinerant handyman who had briefly worked at their home. Investigators built a composite sketch based on her memory, but they asked the family to hold off on releasing it publicly, reportedly unconvinced the lead was strong enough to chase. The family didn't get the sketch out to the public until months later, on America's Most Wanted. Almost immediately, a tip came in identifying the man as Brian David Mitchell. He was arrested within days and Elizabeth was found alive. After Elizabeth was rescued, Salt Lake City's police chief at the time, Rick Dinsey, told reporters something remarkable. With hindsight, he said, investigators wished they'd gone public with that sketch earlier. That's not Ed Smart's theory about his daughter's case. That's the department's own after-action admission. So when Ed Smart looks at the Guthrie case now and says the public deserves more than it's getting, he's not speculating about how transparency helps. He's pointing at the one detail that, once it finally reached the public, ended his own family's nightmare in days. To be fair to investigators, and Smart himself has acknowledged this, law enforcement holds details back, for real reasons. Publicizing every piece of forensic evidence can tip off a guilty party, contaminate future testimony, or let a copycat flood the tip line with false confessions, which has already happened repeatedly in the Guthrie case. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos has said as much directly. Some information is being withheld, he told a local Tucson station, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but to protect the integrity of the case they're building. The honest version of this debate isn't police are hiding the truth for no reason. It's a real trade-off between protecting a fragile case and keeping a community engaged enough to produce the one tip that cracks it. Ed Smart's argument is simply that, in his experience, the balance tips too far towards secrecy for too long. And the Guthrie case gives you several more examples of exactly that tension playing out in real time. Early in the investigation, the FBI recovered mixed DNA evidence from inside Nancy Guthrie's home, meaning genetic material from more than one person was present at the scene. Investigators ran it through CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database, hoping for an immediate match to a known offender. It came back empty, no hit. That dead end didn't make headlines the way a dramatic ransom note does, but for the actual investigation, it may have mattered more. It meant whoever left that DNA either has no prior criminal record in the system, or the sample was never a clean match to begin with. Search efforts also stretched far beyond Tucson. Volunteer search groups, acting on tips and theories floated online, organized cross-border search operations in Mexico, driven partly by a competing theory that Nancy Guthrie may have been trafficked south rather than killed close to home. One organized ground search reportedly located a cluster of roughly 24 unmarked graves in a rural area, a discovery that generated a wave of speculative headlines within hours, long before any authority could confirm whether the site had any connection to this case at all. As of this recording, no forensic link between those graves and Nancy Guthrie has been publicly confirmed. And it's worth remembering that unmarked graves, grim as that sounds, aren't unique to any one criminal case. Rural search grids across the Southwest turn up unrelated historical burial sites more often than true crime headlines tend to acknowledge. That's not a reason to dismiss the Mexico search theory entirely. Investigators haven't ruled out a trafficking angle publicly, and volunteer search coordination has, in other cases, turned up genuine leads police were slow to chase. It's a reason to hold the theory loosely, the same way Ed Smart would tell you to hold almost everything in this case loosely, until it's actually confirmed. Behavioral profilers who've reviewed the public details of the case have also weighed in on what the crime scene itself suggests. Some true crime commentators and retired investigators have floated staging theories, the idea that certain details of the scene may have been arranged to suggest one narrative while obscuring another. That's squarely in theory territory, not confirmed fact, and it's worth saying clearly, no law enforcement agency has publicly endorsed a staging theory in this case. Then there's the theory that circulated the widest on true crime podcasts and forums, the so-called waiter and chef theory, which surfaced most prominently through a News Nation-affiliated documentary examining the case. The theory proposes a working relationship connection to Nancy Guthrie predating her disappearance. But like the staging theory, it remains speculative, sourced to documentary reporting rather than to any statement from investigators or prosecutors. And then there's perhaps the strangest thread in this entire case, the suggestion that the investigation itself may have been compromised from the inside. On the podcast Two Angry Men, legal analyst Jesse Levin, citing an unnamed FBI insider, claimed that investigators privately suspected a member of the media may have planted a piece of evidence early in the case, evidence Levin declined to specify on air, saying investigators hadn't taken action on it. Levin's co-host, attorney Mark Geragos, didn't dispute the claim. It has not been confirmed by the FBI, and no member of the media has been named or charged in connection with it. But if even a fraction of it holds up, it would mean this investigation hasn't just struggled with public rumor. It may have had to contend with contamination of its own evidence trail. Take all of that together, a DNA dead end, cross-border searches turning up more questions than answers, competing theories from separate camps of investigators and outside experts, and now an unconfirmed allegation of evidence tampering by someone inside the media. And you start to see why Ed Smart's core argument lands the way it does. This isn't a case where investigators are sitting on one tidy secret. It's a case buried under competing, unverified narratives, several of which contradict each other. In that kind of environment, Smart's argument is that silence doesn't protect the investigation. It just lets whichever rumor is loudest fill the void where confirmed information should be. There's a version of this story that's easy to tell in headlines. There's a harder version that lives inside the house, in the hours between news cycles, when nothing is happening and everyone is still waiting. Ed Smart has described that waiting as its own kind of injury. Talking about the not knowing, he's called it an emotional wreck, something closer to an open wound that never gets the chance to close because there's no answer yet to close it with. You can't grieve, you can't celebrate, you just hold both possibilities at once for as long as it takes. That's the emotional terrain Savannah Guthrie and her siblings have been living in since February. And it's compounded by something almost nobody talks about directly. For a while, in almost every disappearance like this, the family itself becomes a subject of scrutiny, sometimes publicly, sometimes just within the investigation. In the Guthrie case, online speculation zeroed in on Nancy's eldest daughter, Annie Guthrie, and her husband Tommaso Cioni, in part because they were reportedly among the last people to see Nancy before she vanished. Some commentators floated the idea publicly. Ed Smart addressed that speculation directly in an interview, and he didn't hedge. He said there's no value in indulging conspiracy theories about the family, adding that the Guthries have reportedly been looked at and cleared, and that speculation about them shouldn't still be circulating. The Pima County Sheriff's Office confirmed in February that Cioni had been formally cleared. It's worth sitting with why that matters, because Ed Smart knows exactly what it's like to be on the other side of that speculation. Not adjacent to it, but at the center of it. In the early days of the search for Elizabeth, investigators didn't rule the family out. Ed Smart and his brother Tom were both looked at as potential suspects. A grim statistical reality in child abduction cases, where family involvement is unfortunately common enough that police can't ignore it. Ed has since described how disorienting that was, being told, through his own wife, that police weren't fully convinced of his account. He said the shock of that moment left him physically shaking, unable to stop. He was formally interviewed and ultimately cleared, along with the rest of the family, before investigators turned their attention elsewhere. Even the victim's own family isn't spared scrutiny. That's not corruption, it's statistics. His point, looking at the Guthrie case now, isn't that this scrutiny is wrong. It's that it has to move fast. Every day spent reconfirming that the immediate family isn't involved is a day the actual search isn't fully focused outward, onto the strangers, the past acquaintances, the people who are actually more likely to be responsible. That urgency is exactly what's driving some of the most pointed recent criticism of how the Guthrie investigation has been run. In mid-July, retired FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer publicly urged investigators to expand ground searches into the surrounding desert. She drew a comparison to a decades-old Arizona case, that of Thelma Gaston, an elderly woman who went missing 40 years earlier and whose remains were only recently identified near Sugarloaf Mountain through advances in DNA testing, decades after she'd been killed by someone close to her. Coffindaffer's point was blunt. Cases like this can take generations to close if the physical searching doesn't keep pace with the theorizing. She specifically called for expanded searches into remote desert terrain, updated billboards featuring suspect imagery, and a larger reward. That reward has already climbed once, from an initial $50,000 offered in the first days of the search to over $1 million as the case dragged on without resolution. Itself a quiet signal of how much pressure the family and investigators are under to generate new leads. Investigators have also said they're still working through thousands of individual tips, a volume that's both a resource and a burden. Every credible lead is in there somewhere, buried among the false confessions, mistaken sightings, and outright hoaxes that a case this visible inevitably attracts. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos has publicly maintained, even 5 months in, that he believes an arrest will eventually be made. Whether that confidence is grounded in real, unreleased evidence, or is simply the kind of thing a sheriff has to say to keep public morale from collapsing entirely, is impossible for outside observers to know. That's precisely the bind Ed Smart is describing. A public that has no way to tell the difference between "we have a real lead we can't discuss yet" and "we have nothing but we need you to keep believing we do." For the Guthrie family, 5 months in, that's the reality they're sitting inside. A case still technically open as a kidnapping, shadowed by a note that may or may not be real, suggesting an outcome nobody wants to say out loud. So what do you actually do, as a family, when you feel like the investigation has gone quiet and the trail is going cold? Ed Smart's answer, drawn from his own experience, isn't to fight the police publicly. It's to push, carefully, without becoming an adversary to the people who still control access to the case file. Families in these situations walk a narrow line, challenge decisions they disagree with, without alienating the detectives they still need in their corner. That's part of why, in his interviews about the Guthrie case, Smart keeps circling back to a specific piece of advice. Keep Nancy's story in the public eye, not because it pressures police, but because it works around the limits of what any single investigation can do alone. A tip line only works if people are still watching. A composite sketch only helps if it's actually been shown to the one person, somewhere, who recognizes a face. For families who feel a case has genuinely stalled, some do go a step further and bring in a private investigator. Someone whose only job is the case, without the caseload of a detective juggling dozens of others. It's not a fix-all. A private investigator can't compel evidence the way police can, and a poorly chosen one can complicate a prosecution down the line by chasing leads sloppily. But for families desperate for movement, it's one of the only levers they have real control over. The through line in all of this is the same idea, said a few different ways. Families in these cases are rarely powerless, even when they feel like it. They can't make an arrest, but they can keep attention alive, keep pressure on gently and constructively, and, when the moment allows, bring in outside help without torching the relationship with the investigators who are still, ultimately, the ones who can close the case. Ed Smart has actually demonstrated this balance in real time throughout the Guthrie case, across a string of morning show appearances since February. Early on Fox Friends, he framed the Guthrie family's own public video plea to the kidnappers as strategically sound. Telling captors directly that the family was willing to cooperate, he said, is exactly the kind of message that can open a door law enforcement alone can't. Weeks later, on CBS Mornings, he went further, describing the situation as surreal for him personally, watching a nearly identical set of circumstances unfold in someone else's family a generation later, and reiterating that community-driven visibility was, in his experience, what ultimately changed his own daughter's case. Notice what he's not doing in any of those appearances. He's not accusing the Pima County Sheriff's Department of incompetence, and he's not telling the Guthrie family to distrust their investigators. He's modeling exactly the narrow lane he describes, visible, vocal, persistent, but never adversarial toward the people still doing the actual police work. 24 years after Elizabeth Smart came home, Ed Smart still talks about her case in the present tense sometimes. Not because it isn't resolved, but because living through something like this doesn't have a finish line, where everything just goes back to normal. There's a new normal instead, one where the fear doesn't fully leave, even after the outcome you prayed for actually happens. That's the version of hope Ed Smart is offering the Guthrie family. Not a guarantee, but a data point. His daughter came home after 9 months, after most people had quietly stopped believing she would. He said himself that this isn't the typical outcome in cases like this. But it's not nothing either. As of this recording, Nancy Guthrie is still missing. The FBI still hasn't settled publicly on whether the most chilling letter in this case is real or another cruel hoax. No suspect has been named. And a family that includes one of the most recognized faces on morning television is still doing something achingly ordinary and human, waiting by the phone. If there's one thing to take from Ed Smart's perspective on all of this, It's not really about the Guthrie case specifically. It's about every case like it. A vigilant public paying attention, sharing what they know, refusing to let the story go quiet, isn't a substitute for police work. But in the cases that get solved against the odds, it's very often the missing piece that police work alone couldn't provide. Think about what actually happened in Elizabeth Smart's case. It wasn't a fingerprint. It wasn't a DNA hit. It was a 9-year-old girl's memory of a man's face held onto for months, matched against a grainy sketch that almost never made it to the public at all. And then, finally, recognized by 2 strangers who happened to be paying attention on the right afternoon in Sandy, Utah. That's not a story about brilliant police work closing a case through withheld evidence. It's a story about what happens when the public is finally let in. Nancy Guthrie's case hasn't had that moment yet. Maybe the letter is real, and there's no one left to find. Maybe it's a cruel hoax layered on top of an already devastating situation, and she's still out there somewhere, waiting on the version of hope Ed Smart is describing. Nobody watching this video knows which. Neither, it seems, does the FBI. But if the last 24 years have taught Ed Smart anything worth repeating to the Guthrie family, and to anyone watching a case like this unfold, it's that the answer has, more than once, come from somewhere nobody expected. Not a task force, not a database, but a person out there, right now, who already knows something they haven't said out loud yet. If you have information on Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, contact the FBI Phoenix field office.